am speaking away. And I'll keep speaking until you get the microphone levels working. And okay, very good. And then if I could just get my PowerPoint up, I'll be happy. Now, I have noticed that chapel speakers take off their mask, but there's no plastic. Okay. Blood is on your hands, Ray. Okay.
Hello, hello. Testing 1, 2. Hello, hello. Hello, 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 hello.
All right. When Jesus is my portion, a constant friend is he. His eye is on the sparrow. because my, oops, so we'll begin. Welcome everyone to the latest installment in the Bible Colloquium series. Thank you for coming. I'm presenting a paper here on Mark 6:48. I have the entire paper written up with footnotes. It's a rough draft, but I do hope to send it out in the nearby future. So if you're interested in a hard copy of everything that I'm saying, send me an email and I'd be happy to send that to you. Or if you're interested in chasing down some of the footnotes or taking a closer look at some of the Greek or something like that, it would be helpful. Well, let's begin. I have been thinking about Mark 6 for a while as I've been doing this research, but I realize some of you may not have been spending all of your free moments looking at Mark 6. So let's begin by reading it from a sort of, a pretty literal translation, the New American Standard. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side of Bethsaida, while he himself was sending the crowd away. After bidding them farewell, he left for the mountain to pray. When it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, at about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. And he intended to pass by them. That's what the New American Standard has. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed that it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke with them and said to them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them. The wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. The title of my paper is Mark's Miraculous Disciples, Jesus' desire for his followers to walk on water in that bolded section, Mark 6:48. Mark records that while the disciples were caught in a storm and rowing against the waves, Jesus came to them walking on the sea in Mark 6:48. But like the disciples misunderstood what they then saw, interpreters of this account are similarly confronted with an expression that has proven difficult to comprehend. The Greek is ethelen parelthein autus. Taking the clause to mean something like he intended to pass by them surfaces numerous questions about the narrative. If Jesus came that far on the sea, was it not to come to the disciples' aid? And why would he only want to pass by them? With the implication that he only intended to do so, but he didn't. Why doesn't he continue passing them? How do the disciples, and with their fearful response, interact with Jesus' earlier desire? Now, a variety of possible interpretations have been offered to explain this enigmatic clause by focusing on the first word, ethelen, or the second, parelthein. He wanted to pass by. After briefly surveying these interpretations, we will see reasons for another interpretation that focuses on the syntactic function of the third word, autus. Though current scholarship offers a wide variety of interpretations for the mysterious statement, it shares in common the assumption that autus, them, is the object of the infinitive phrase, and that the earlier subject of the verb ethelen, Jesus, is the agent of the infinitive's action. So, for example, translations have, he intended to pass them by, the NRSV. He was about to pass them by, the NIV. Or something like, Jesus intended to reveal himself to them, which is an interpretation given in many commentaries. This essay argues instead that the accusative denotes the agent of the infinitive's action, so that Jesus desires them, the disciples, to approach. After establishing this possibility, we will consider contextual reasons in its favor. Moreover, though certainty regarding Mark's obscure expression will ultimately elude us, we'll also explore reasons for thinking Matthew's use of Mark suggests that he understood Mark similarly to the configuration presented here, and has included Peter's coming to Jesus as doing what the disciples in Mark do not do. So let's begin by looking at current proposals for this expression. Modern scholarship offers several possible interpretations of ethelen parelthein autus. It may be that parelthein indicates what Jesus seemed to be doing from the disciples' perspective. R.T. France suggests, quote, the clause is best seen not as a statement of what was in Jesus' mind, but of how his approach appeared from the disciples' point of view. This mysterious figure on the water seemed at first to be making his way past the boat, end quote. This takes thelo as akin to melo, and the NIV has, he was about to pass them by. Larry Hurtado's perspective is similar, that Jesus, quote, intended to make himself visible to the disciples to relieve their fear, end quote, but that their cries stop him later. Schweitzer understands it as Jesus wanting to go beyond them so as to test their faith. But in all of these interpretations, one wonders why Jesus abandons his initial plan. Let's go back there. Okay. Others claim that the answer lies in an allusion to the Old Testament. Flederman has drawn attention to parallels in Amos 7:8 and 8:2 to argue that Mark wants readers to see Jesus as intending to save them. But currently, the number one explanation on the market, if you open up commentaries written in the last decade or so, is what I'm going to call the Epiphany view. This focuses on parelthein to argue that Jesus' purpose was to reveal himself to the disciples by evoking Old Testament theophanies. Garland's exposition well represents this view. Thus, the verb parerchomai, to pass by, when connected to a divinity, refers to an epiphany. This verb occurs in two key passages in the Old Testament. In Exodus 33 and 34, Moses asks God to show him his glory, and God responds by passing before him and proclaiming his identity. And in 1 Kings 19, 11 to 12, the Lord tells Elijah to stand on the mountain, for the Lord is about to pass by. As a side note, I don't think that's a coincidence. I think 1 Kings 19 is directly playing off Exodus 33. But to return to Garland, one can conclude from these passages that when Jesus wants to pass by his disciples, he wills for them to see his transcendent majesty as a divine being and to give them reassurance, end quote. Now, Stein, in his commentary, identifies a difficulty with the Epiphany view, although he concedes that it is the least unlikely interpretation. And he observes that, quote, "It is unclear whether Mark's readers or hearers would have understood it in this way during the initial reading or hearing. Whether they possessed a sufficient knowledge of the Old Testament and the technical use of pass by to refer to an epiphany is uncertain. In the vast majority of instances where parerchomai occurs in the Septuagint, it does not bear this technical meaning. We must further remember that this understanding would have had to take place during the continuous reading of the gospel without pause or time for reflection." While each of the canonical evangelists desires their readers to really be thinking about Jesus in connection and fulfillment with the Old Testament, I think Stein is onto something here. This is expecting an awful lot from his readers. I do believe that there are deeper connections that can be made upon further reflection with the Old Testament, but I like the way R.T. France calls them. He describes these as bonus points for the astute reader who wants to meditate more deeply on the text. Deeper meanings are found. However, the Epiphany view requires that these Old Testament connections be made for even the account to be intelligible. This proposal struggles to answer questions about the surface-level storyline. In other words, even if we grant that passing by echoes theophanies in the Old Testament, the action itself and its narrative sequence remains just as strange. And listeners are still left asking the numerous questions about the narrative that I mentioned earlier. So why is it, at the end of the day, that he only wants to pass them by? Furthermore, the use of want presents another difficulty with the Epiphany view. If Mark intends his readers to understand parelthein as to reveal his divine power, then we are still left wondering about the presence of wanting. The use of want would be unnecessary, even inaccurate, since Jesus does actually walk on the sea. He does, therefore, manifest himself. And of course, interpreters can always wish that the writer of Scripture would have been clearer and made our jobs a lot easier. Nonetheless, the difficulty of accounting for wish language is a strike against the Epiphany view. But if that's the only option that we have, I think it's the best thing on the market, in the absence of anything better. But what I would like to do is present what I think is something better. So the possibility of this expression meaning he wanted them to come by. Understanding the Greek this way requires two considerations. First, instead of taking parerchomai as meaning to pass by, I will argue it's preferable to see the meaning here as to come by. For their first entry, the lexicon BDAG lists, quote, to go past a reference point, to go by, to pass by, and they include Mark 6:48 in that entry. But their last entry is, quote, to stop at a place as one comes by, to, come by, come here. Little Scott Jones does something similar, and so does the new Brill Dictionary of Ancient Greek. Luke 12:37 can be taken as an example here. I'll skip to the English. Blessed are those servants whom, when the master comes, he will find them ready. Truly I say to you that he will gird himself and will cause them to recline, and having arrived, parelthon, he will serve them. Here the idea of parelthon can hardly be passed by, but must be something like arriving or coming by. In this text, at least, it's difficult to distinguish between parelthon and elthon. So what would happen if we adopted the meaning arrive or come by for parerchomai as the sense in Mark 6:48? Taking the syntax as it's normally understood would yield the meaning he wanted to come by them, but that's just unhelpful. In this case, Mark would be merely restating what he just said earlier in the verse, that he came to them walking on the sea. Not only would this merely repeat the idea, but the introduction of he wanted to come by them would make this reading highly unlikely. I can hardly imagine Mark saying that Jesus came to them and then wanted to come to them, but then he didn't, and then later we read that he actually enters the boat. The implausibility of this reconstruction may be what has stopped interpreters from understanding parerchomai in this way. However, we can understand the syntax otherwise. And I've got both options up there on the screen. I'd like to argue that Mark 6:48 is best seen as an infinitive with a subject accusative, in which the accusative case denotes the agent of an infinitive, if different from the previous subject. Now, this is easy enough to see in the English. You've got it right up here. Notice that the them looks like a direct object in both. In English, the difference between he wanted them to come by and he wanted to come by them is simply the location of the word them. All you need to know at this point, if you don't know Greek, is that Greek doesn't rely on word order like this. And so it's just as easy to move that word them. So both are possibilities with the infinitive. And of course, this possibility has been well documented in grammars. But an example using thelo, wish, and a form of erchomai will demonstrate how this is the case even for verbs used in our text. In Acts 16:3, in Acts 16:3, we read, Paul wanted this one, talking about Timothy, to come with him. The agent of the action, exelthein, has changed from the subject of wanted, Paul, and is expressed with the accusative teuton, in this context, Timothy. If the syntax is to be understood similarly in Mark 6:48, a translation would be, and he, Jesus, wanted them, the disciples, to come by. Not only does Jesus come to them on the water, but he also intends for them to do the same and meet him. However, instead of, as the but, taking this step of faith, they fail to respond to his invitation by reacting in fear. So, all that I've done now is establish that this is a valid move, that you can do this. But is it likely? Possibility comes cheap. What about probability? Though both the lexical categories of parerchomai and the syntax allows for this, we do have evidence that this is Mark's purpose. And I'm going to consider two pieces of evidence which point in this direction. First, let's look at the narrative flow at this juncture in Mark. This suggests that Jesus desires his disciples to exercise miraculous power and come to him. Jesus calls the disciples early on in Mark 1, and Jesus wants them to follow him. And then the next description in 3:13-21 specifically concerns the 12 with a purpose statement so that they might be with him and that he might send them to preach and to have authority to cast out demons. That's part of what it means to be one of the 12 disciples. Now, this component of their discipleship is first enacted in chapter 6 of Mark, verses 7-13, which again states that the disciples receive authority to participate in Jesus' own ministry. And we read of some success in this regard. They come back excited that this thing actually works. Thus, the disciples are being trained that in Jesus' absence, they are to exercise his same miraculous authority. The commentator Marcus stresses this idea with what must surely be hyperbolic language. He writes, quote, "The church is the community of those chosen to be with Jesus in the way of the cross, but also in the new life of empowerment that is found as they tread that difficult and treacherous path. Jesus Christ and the Christian community, therefore, are not separable realities in Mark's eyes," end quote. That's a bit much, but it stresses it very nicely. When the story refocuses on Jesus after this interlude regarding Herod and John in Mark 6:14-29, the disciples begin to rest, but they're interrupted by an eager crowd. Now, in our account, Mark returns his reader to the theme of the disciples' absence from Jesus. Now, notice in our story of Jesus walking on the water, Mark devotes a full 3 verses out of 8 in telling the story to stress that the disciples are, in fact, away from Jesus. He finds multiple ways of saying the same thing. Furthermore, the obvious similarities with the sea calming incident in 4:35-41 prompt the reader to compare the two pericope. There, a storm arises, but Jesus is present with the disciples. That's a big part of that first storm story. Jesus is there, asleep on the boat, so of course they shouldn't worry. But the logic of this next story is, what are they going to do now that Jesus is gone? It's a completely different scenario, isn't it? Do they still have that same kind of divine protection? Those who have been reading Mark carefully should know that the answer is yes. The disciples are being trained to follow Jesus' miraculous example even when he is not present. Not only does the motif of being trained to do the miraculous while away from Jesus support this idea that Jesus wants them to come on the water, but the specific account of the feeding of the 5,000 particularly stresses this point. I was fascinated by this detail as I was doing this study. Besides just these two accounts being placed back to back, Mark concludes that the reason that they didn't understand what was happening was because they didn't understand about the loaves. This strange comment raises questions like, well, why didn't they understand? And why that episode? I mean, of all the other things in Mark to point out. In particular, why not the reference to the previous calming of the sea incident? If the point had been the disciples' inadequate Christology, these questions are difficult to answer. And overlooking the previous calming of the storm in preference to the feeding of the 5,000 is almost incomprehensible. Instead, if the walking on the water incident includes an element of challenging the disciples to exercise their miraculous authority by coming to Jesus, the connection is logical, since the feeding of the 5,000 includes that component as well. This perspective fits in well with what Collins and Henderson advocate, although neither of them advocate the syntax that I'm arguing for. Collins writes, "The hidden motivation of Jesus in 6:45-46 is to give the disciples yet another opportunity to exercise and demonstrate the power of their faith. The reference to the loaves in verses 52, like the dismissal of the crowd in verse 45, links this story to the previous one, the feeding of the 5,000. The disciples fail to realize that they could have controlled the wind and to grasp the significance of Jesus' walking on the sea, because they could not conceive of the possibility of feeding the crowd themselves, nor do they understand the significance for his identity of Jesus' feeding the crowds. Their proposal that Jesus send the crowd away shows that they have not understood his divine power and their potential share in it," end quote. The previous account of the feeding of the 5,000 also includes this challenge for the disciples to do the miraculous. Now, I have to admit that Collins and Henderson are in the minority in seeing a call to do the miraculous in Mark's version. But when you open up commentaries on Matthew, it's a completely different story. Matthew commentaries are much more likely to see a call for the disciples to do the miraculous. Since the disciples have been given miraculous authority, particularly in conjunction to not being concerned with bread, the imperative, you give them something to eat, in Mark 6:37, is best understood as a sincere command. There's no good reason to think that this is insincere or that they could not have done so. Since Mark himself invites his readers to compare the walking on the water pericope and the feeding of the 5,000, the invitation in 6:37 for the disciples to overcome the difficulties before them by using their bestowed authority suggests that Jesus has a similar desire for them in 6:48. Furthermore, the failure of the disciples to act in faith and Jesus' stepping in to resolve the situation also links the two. The next thing I'd like for us to look at is support for the phrase meaning he wanted them to come by from the Gospel of Matthew. Now, on one version of this, I have support, and another one I have the word evidence. I think maybe evidence is a little bit of a better expression. The things that I mentioned before about Mark, I think, fall into the category of support. I'm unsure how much to rely on Matthew's use to argue my case here, but I do think it's worthy of note and is evidence that at least Matthew is on the same page as what I've been describing. Now, Matthew, when you turn to his account in chapter 14 of his gospel, in 22 to 33, narrates this event in very dissimilar ways. So our argument can't be that events in Matthew must have some parallel in Mark. That just won't work. It is possible that Matthew has some extra source concerning Peter, maybe an oral tradition, and so the Matthean Peter's walking on the water has no relevance for our inquiry. Yet, in light of the plausibility of understanding the expression in Mark 6:48 in the way suggested here, and particularly the discipleship themes which lead up to such a reading, that Matthew specifically describes Peter as walking out on the water confirms that Matthew and Mark similarly see Jesus' miraculous power as something to be shared with the disciples. Now, hopefully that's not too small for you to see. This chart here illustrates some of the differences between Matthew and Mark. The commentators Davies and Allison note 10 changes, and I'll just read the last 4. That Matthew has, quote, deleted the difficult remark that Jesus wanted to pass them by, which is what I want to talk about. He has passed over Mark 6:50a, for all saw him and were troubled, as adding nothing. 9 inserted the incident involving Peter, which of course is a big deal, in 14:28 to 31, and they say completely altered the conclusions so that now the disciples, instead of not understanding, confess Jesus to be the Son of God, end quote. Carson has a good treatment of this in his Expositor's Bible commentary, where he shows that they are not as different as some people say that they are. And the idea of marveling doesn't necessarily need to be negative. Now, what I think is that an appealing feature of the interpretation I'm suggesting is that it explains several of these changes. If Matthew understood the clause in Mark 6:48 to communicate Jesus' will for the disciples to come, to him that is, that would address 3 of the 4 redactions noted earlier. In this understanding, the Matthean Peter fulfills the desire of the Mark in Jesus. Matthew has not so much omitted the clause in Mark 6:48, but has replaced it with the account of Peter in Matthew 14:28 to 31. Furthermore, this proposal also sheds light on Davies and Allison's last noted redaction in Mark 14:33 of Mark 6:51 to 52, in which the disciples fail to understand. In other words, in Matthew, they do, or at least Peter does not completely fail to understand, and he gets the significance of what Jesus is doing. Peter in Matthew, at least, grasp the significance of what's happening. And though eventually he fails, he has gained enough insight to at least try. The request, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you upon the water," in Matthew 14:28, it demonstrates that Peter in Matthew wants to share in this miraculous power of Jesus. Now, Matthew and Mark may understand this narrative differently. Though they both clearly see a major Christological element involved, it may be that Matthew alone wants to portray the sovereign power in Jesus as something in which the disciples ought to participate. However, the factors that lead up to Peter requesting to walk on the water, like the conferral of Jesus' authority in 10:1 and the challenge to miraculously feed the people in 14:16, as we've already seen, are also present in Mark. I think that we shouldn't stress the difference between Matthew and Mark too much. It is more likely that Matthew and Mark are on the same page in this regard, since their Gospels have been progressing in this same direction, and that Mark's ethelen paralthenautus should be understood as he wanted them to come by, and thus contributes to the theme of the disciples sharing in Jesus' own miraculous ability. Thank you very much for listening. I am very eager to get whatever questions or critiques or problems that you see. It is so much better to be embarrassed in front of you than embarrassed in front of an unfriendly audience. So, it may begin now. Yes, Dr. Fish.
Did they do anything miraculous in the feeding of the 5,000?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure. Now, the way that in Mark, at least, in Mark 6, they say, no, we can't buy these people any bread. And so Jesus takes, the bread and he breaks it and he gives it. It's an imperfect there. I think it's edidu. He gives it to them. So it could be that he gives them just those initial loaves, and then they keep passing it out and are doing something miraculous as they pass it out to the crowds. Or it could be like an iterative. In other words, they get something from Jesus and they go deliver it to the people, and then their basket's empty, and so then they come back to Jesus, and Jesus miraculously supplies them more bread. So I think it could go either way there. I think Mark chapter 6 clearly shows the disciples doing miraculous activity earlier as they are sent out on their mission and they cast out demons and things like that. The thing that I was wanting to stress was that Jesus is expecting them to do the miraculous.
Yeah, and he tells them to do the healing and to the things that are normally stressed as healing, casting out demons, and to teach.
Yeah.
But when it comes to this, it was just interesting. I was reading this verse in Mark 6 in Zerwick's grammar this morning. That's why I was thinking about it. He makes a distinction between that he broke the loaves. That's an aorist. He gave it to the disciples, he blessed, and he broke the loaves. Those were aorists, and he was giving it to the disciples. And what he was saying, the miraculous was done by Jesus, and the disciples, over and over again, were coming back to him for the bread. That was the imperfect. And there doesn't, you don't really see, there's nothing that would indicate that the disciples did any miraculous in the feeding of the 5,000. And
my point that I was relying upon was that Jesus is pushing them to do that, and when he says, you give them something to eat, but then they say they don't. So if we read it in that this is like an iterative, they keep coming back to Jesus or something, and that Jesus is the only one doing miracles in the feeding of the 5,000, it still is because the disciples have failed to do what Jesus has asked them to do. But that same imperfect is also used when it describes him giving them authority. That also is an imperfect. So it's a question of how much do you want to lean into the imperfect there. Oh.
Has anybody had this interpretation before you? And, did anybody take the Greek in the way that you take it?
Nobody has taken the Greek syntax of this infinitive phrase this way. Now, there have been people who think that the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus wants the disciples to do the miraculous. That's not new. A lot of commentaries say that. And there are major commentaries who say that the disciples are expected to calm the storm by themselves in Mark 6. But everybody is stuck in the same rut of understanding the syntax in 648 that same way. Now, I put it that way because I think I'm right, but yes. Professor Kunjman.
Just a small point, rather than come by, you can come beside. I think would work well in what you're arguing. And I think the point is to be taken because both Matthew and Mark point out in connection with the feeding of the 5,000, the Lord telling them to feed them. And most of the time we just go past it without taking a cue that maybe he did want them to do something extraordinary. And maybe to follow up on Dr. Bush's comment in Matthew 10:8, when he sends them out, he says...
wait a minute, Professor Kunjman. I have forgotten to do the one thing I was asked to do. Do we still want to pass around the microphone? Never mind. Okay, I was told to pass the mic.
In Matthew 10:8, when the disciples are sent out on their ministry, he says, heal the sick, raise the dead, and it was a given. I mean, there's no better miracle than that. Cleanse lepers, cast out demons. So he actually charges them, sends them out, telling them to do even the most that we can think of in terms of miracles. So I think it's an intriguing, and we're surely on good grounds with the syntax, because the subject of the infinitive does appear in the accusative, and it's equally possible either way. So it's very intriguing.
Thank you.
could you summarize?
He said it's very intriguing. He was saying that in Matthew 10, the disciples are even told to raise the dead. And it wouldn't be, I would rank calming the storm or feeding the 5,000 as easier to do than raising the dead. So he's given them an incredible amount of authority, and sometimes we don't really let that influence the way that we read the later passages, as he seems to ask them to do impossible things.
Or I was saying the way you were saying that when we read the feeding of 5,000, we think he's challenging them to feed them, to let them see that they can, but maybe that wasn't the intention at all. Right? It's saying
Yes, no. One of the few commentaries who is in on whether or not the disciples can do this and says no is Schnabel, and he says because the disciples never do any other nature miracles. But for me, I think that if they can raise dead people, then this should not be beyond their pay grade.
It was done by Elisha in the Old Testament.
Yes. Yes, Mr. Kozin.
Can you make that link of the walking on water, the strolling in the storm to the Old Testament? I mean, even the 5,000, maybe that manna, what was to be there, or the other miraculous things. Is there some sort of link you could say this should have been expected or known?
Well, walking on the water is, now, it depends on how much of a stickler you want to be. There are, of course, connections with Elijah and Moses if we allow for parting the water. Moses and Elijah did not walk on the Red Sea or on the Jordan. So if we're willing to kind of look past that and say, yeah, but still they were doing incredible things with water so they could get by, then there's some sort of a connection. But there are plenty of Old Testament passages that talk about that it is God's prerogative to walk on the water. It is interesting to read the commentaries because sometimes, especially in Matthew, where it's much more obvious, of course, with Peter, well, they will say, only God can walk on water. And then Matthew walks on water, and then they just kind of, for the sake of time, we're going to move on to the next thing. But that does kind of throw a monkey wrench into how we understand the symbolism of walking on the water.
There's a passage where Elisha feeds a number, I don't have the reference right now, but I think Elisha does feed a multitude miraculously like this.
Yes, that's right. It's 2 Kings 4.
Now, but in terms of miracles, the miracles were intended to be signs. So Jesus is miraculously walking on the water was a sign to the disciples. Are you saying he's calling on them to walk on the water?
Yes, that is what I'm arguing for.
And you have Peter doing it, but how would that be a sign? The way we see all of the other miraculous signs of Jesus and the disciples throughout the Gospels and Acts.
I would say it's a sign similar to the kind of signs that they do in their mission, like earlier in chapter 6 and then in Matthew chapter 10. So the same purpose for which they are allowed to do miraculous signs in Mark 6 and 10. Whatever answer one wants to give to that would then apply to why Jesus would allow them to walk on water. So they are, particularly in John's gospel, they are signs of Jesus' identity. The emphasis in the synoptics is more signs of the kingdom.
Who would this be signs to?
I see. Well,
I'm throwing out something because is there anything, you just call me crazy, to the superiority of Jesus? So Jesus often is pointed back to Elijah and Moses, and there's comparisons, right? Elijah, then Elisha, and then Moses and Joshua, and Jesus' disciples. There's sort of that parallel. Is there something about the superiority? Because Jesus casts out demons and tells his disciples to do the same. Moses and Elijah didn't do that. Like there's one thing about parting the water. Is walking on water, like, I don't even have to part it. I literally can, is there something about Jesus being superior even to these Old Testament?
Yes, let me quickly respond in that I would say I don't think all of the miraculous works need to be signs. So, and that language is not brought up here, so it's not of a concern in Mark chapter 6, although I'll have to give that further thought. But then to Mr. Brown's point was that I think that does happen often where, like with the Elijah one that Dr. Fish brought up, he feeds, I think it's with like 100 loaves of fish, 500 men. He has more to work with and he feeds less people. But when the Lord does it, he has less material and with a bigger audience. So it is taking what you've seen in the prophets and elevating it to a higher level. So that's an interesting idea. Yes.
This comment is entirely speculative, so it won't be helpful. But the early Christian writers attributed Mark's gospel to his association with Peter. So Peter, in some ways, stood behind Mark. So it's interesting that Mark doesn't include Peter actually walking on the water, but speculatively, if your understanding of the phrase is correct, it could have potentially been Peter communicating to Mark the story that Jesus invited us to come onto the water, and then, for whatever reason, Matthew narrates Peter actually. Again, entirely speculative, so not helpful. Just a thought.
Yes, it is. Once you start thinking about sources and why is it that Mark would not have recorded this if he has some sort of association with Peter and he would have known about it, why would he not have? It's almost could be used as an argument against any sort of Peter influence, that a person could reason, listen, if Mark is getting his information from Peter, I think Peter would have told him about, there was this time I walked on water.
The one we conveyed, right?
Yes, that's right.
Leave that.
That's right. But it is interesting. Thank you for that. One other further thing to go back with Dr. Fish's thing about the signs. You can only include so much in this, but depending on how much symbolism we see in the waters as either representing demonic forces, that may also create a link with the authority to cast out demons. There is some evidence to suggest that stormy water is linked with demonic activity. And so then to tread on the water would be parallel to having authority. I think this would contribute to Mark's theme of Jesus is training his disciples, but that they fail, and yet he does not give up on them, even though there's nobody there specifically to see it. It's part of the training mission. Yes?
Support for other failures of the disciples? So Mark 9 failing to cast out the demons, and are there any enough patterns that you can say, hey, here's another failure? They also fail here, they also fail here.
Oh, yes. Now that's also interesting because Mark's description of the disciples is much more negative than Matthew or Luke's. The general consensus is that Luke has the most positive view, Mark has the most negative, and Matthew has the most complicated with pros and cons. So it would make more sense. I mean, you can even see that with the worship scene at the end, where Mark describes the disciples as just being amazed and in fear, whereas Matthew has them worshiping him and saying, truly you are the Son of God. So it's kind of, Matthew is more concerned about saying yes and no. And John's disciples are flat. They don't really do, they don't receive much characterization. Yes, Mr. Routley. Yeah, that's helpful. And so the idea is that he came to them and he wanted to come. Yes, I can address that. I feel like I could wing it and come up with an answer right now, but your point is well taken. Um, it still would be awkward, I think, in the flow of thought that he came by them and he wanted to come by them, but they were afraid, and so he spoke to them and then got on the boat. Of course, a person can always, like I mentioned this earlier, we should be leery of the argumentation that if the person meant what you say that he meant, he would have put it in an easier way, and so that must mean you're not right, because that could destroy any argument, and it's just an unfair standard. But that's a good area of weakness. Thank you all very much. This has been helpful to me and very helpful to get your feedback. I do appreciate it so much. If you would like a copy of anything, please let me know, and I'll be happy to email it to you. Thank you.